Walt Hammond just wanted a peaceful morning with his black coffee and a view of Melton Lake, but a bright orange HOA ticket stuck to his windshield changed everything. He didn't notice it at first. The sun had only just crested over the water, and mist curled along the lake's edge like a sleeping cat. The old Chevy Silverado, rust-kissed at the corners, sat neatly in the gravel pull-off where he'd parked for the last 20 years. That morning, like every other, he'd brought a thermos of coffee and the folded Kingsport Times-News, tucked neatly under his arm, and a quiet heart. He slid onto the truck's tailgate, thermos in hand, and took a long sip. The coffee, dark and bitter, was just the way he liked it. But then, in the corner of his eye, color. A garish orange. He frowned, leaned forward, and peeled the slip from under his windshield wiper. A citation. From Lake Point Ridge HOA. Unauthorized parking, $200 fine. His eyes narrowed. Unauthorized, he murmured. Since when? The ticket crackled in his hands as he folded it into his shirt pocket. The breeze carried the scent of damp leaves and chimney smoke. October always brought the best colors to the lake, golds, reds, and fiery oranges scattered in the water's reflection. But that morning, all he could see was the blocky type of that printed ticket, bold and officious. The HOA office was located in a small white building near the main gate, repurposed from what used to be a gardener's shed. It still smelled faintly of mulch. Walt pushed open the door and was greeted by a sterile desk and a framed poster about community harmony. Behind the counter sat Karen Whitmore. She barely looked up. "Can I help you?" "Got this ticket this morning. Thought maybe it was a mistake." Her eyes flicked up at him, then returned to the screen. "If it's orange, it's not a mistake." Walt stood tall. "I've parked there for 20 years. The lake's not part of the HOA." Karen sighed as if he were wasting her time. "Sir, the gravel area falls within our jurisdiction. New boundary lines went into effect last month." "Was there a vote on that?" "It was an executive decision by the board." Walt nodded slowly. "Right. You're the board." She gave him a tight smile. "We're simply trying to maintain order." "Funny kind of order," he said, tipping his head. "Feels more like control." He left before she could respond. At Darlene's diner, the doorbell chimed as he stepped inside. The place smelled of bacon grease and cinnamon rolls, just like it always had. Darlene greeted him with a warm, "Morning, Walt," and slid his usual black coffee across the counter before he'd even sat down. "You look like you saw a ghost," she said, setting down a menu he didn't need. He slid the orange ticket across the counter. Darlene picked it up, read it, and shook her head. "She got you too, huh?" "Two?" "Rick Granger got fined last week for planting mums on his porch. HOA said they weren't approved colors." Walt snorted. "It's a porch, not a parade." Darlene leaned in, voice lowered. "People are starting to talk. Karen's riling folks up, changing rules without warning. We never had this kind of trouble before she moved in." He sipped his coffee, quiet for a long moment. "Something don't sit right with me about it. That land near the lake used to be public." "Used to be," she echoed. He finished his breakfast, left a few extra dollars on the check, and folded the local paper under his arm. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his cap to Darlene. Outside, he paused by the diner's bulletin board, yard sale signs, a lost cat flyer, and an old photo of the lake back when the dock was still wooden. Later that afternoon, he pulled out a worn leather-bound notebook from the top drawer of his roll-top desk. The pages were filled with sketches, measurements, and notes from years gone by, old engine diagrams, fishing spots, even a few favorite recipes his late wife had scribbled down. He turned to a fresh page and wrote, "Investigate HOA authority, lakefront." That evening, he walked the path behind his house, past the big oaks, down to the lake. The air was cool against his face. He stopped just short of the new, private access, HOA members only, sign hammered into the ground. He stared at it longer than he meant to. What if this land isn't actually hers to control? Walt's quiet investigation begins with a trip to the county records office, armed with a mug of diner coffee and determination. The steam curled from the lip of his ceramic mug, the logo of Darlene's diner half faded from years of refills and rinse cycles. Walt cradled it carefully as he stepped through the double glass doors of Kingsport City Hall, tipping his cap to the receptionist who offered him a smile and a clipboard he didn't need. Late October sun filtered through the high windows, but inside, the chill of fluorescent lighting made the halls feel almost sterile. Yellow leaves clung to the soles of his boots, carried in from the sidewalk mosaic outside. It smelled faintly of old books and linoleum wax. Darlene's voice had stuck with him ever since she said it, that land's been open longer than her HOAs existed. He didn't know what he was looking for, not exactly, but he knew where to start. The records room was tucked beside the assessor's office, its swinging door adorned with a crooked paper sign that read, "Archive access by appointment, ring bell." Walt pressed the button gently. "Coming," called a voice from within. A moment later, out shuffled Mrs. Edith Monroe. Her glasses hung from a beaded chain, and her cardigan was pinned with a brooch shaped like Tennessee. "Well now," she said, peering at him. "I haven't seen you since they tore down the old post office." Walt chuckled. "I figured you'd still be here. You always remembered the Navy maps." Her face lit up. "You still tinkering with those old boundary questions?" "This time it's official." He explained his inquiry: land near Melton Lake, the HOA, a fine he didn't agree with. Edith listened without interrupting, hands folded on the counter, the scent of cinnamon drifting from a jar nearby, filled with striped hard candies. "Federal surplus land," she murmured. "Yes, I do recall a classification change around 73. Let's see what's still on file." She turned slowly, methodically, shuffling through a series of drawers labeled by decade. A younger man appeared in the doorway, earbuds dangling around his neck. "Need a hand, Mrs. Monroe?" "Caleb, could you pull the digital archive for Naval Surplus, Melton Zone?" "Mr. Hammond's doing some old-fashioned detective work." Caleb grinned. "Sure thing. Give me a sec." Walt took a seat at the counter, sipping his coffee, watching Edith move with deliberate care. He liked that, nothing was rushed here. No one barked demands. Just the quiet persistence of people who knew the stories behind every page. 10 minutes later, Caleb returned with a flash drive and a stack of printouts. "This is everything from zoning overlays since 1968. Some are scans of declassified stuff, it's kind of fuzzy, but legible." Walt flipped through the pages. There it was, bold ink across the top, Department of the Navy, declassified. Edith set a manila folder beside him. "This one came out of the dusty bin. Thought you'd appreciate something from the old days." Inside, the map was brittle and yellowing at the folds. But unmistakable. The shaded area running parallel to Melton Lake was labeled, Federal Easement, Reserved, Naval Use. He traced a finger along the boundary. The very same gravel patch where he'd parked for decades was inside that shaded zone. According to the document, that stretch had never been formally released to private development. It had simply existed in limbo. Walt's brow furrowed. "And the HOA?" Edith shook her head. Lake Point Ridge didn't submit zoning paperwork until 2006. Long after this. And nothing here indicates a transfer of jurisdiction. Caleb leaned over. "Means they probably assumed it was theirs. Or someone made a clerical leap." Walt folded the map with care. "I'd like copies of everything. Paper, if possible." Edith smiled. "Still old school." "Old schools never let me down." As he stepped outside, the afternoon sun had dipped lower, casting a long shadow over the sidewalk. He paused to admire the turning oaks that lined the municipal lawn, colors like flame and honey swirling overhead. Then the low hum of an engine made him glance to his left. A white SUV rolled by slowly, Karen Whitmore behind the wheel. She didn't wave. Just stared. Walt met her gaze, calm but unblinking. Back at the diner, he laid the documents out across the booth. Darlene brought over a slice of pecan pie, no questions asked. You find what you were looking for? She asked. Maybe the start of it. She slid into the seat across from him, wiping her hands on her apron. You ought to talk to Bert. Walt raised an eyebrow. Bert Winters. Comes in every Friday. Served over at Melton. Said he saw those old easements years ago. Walt nodded slowly. I'll catch him then. But even as he savored the pie, flaky crust, warm filling, just the right hint of bourbon, his mind was on the folder in his truck. The final page of the map, with the words that hadn't changed in all these years, federal interest, retained. The map shows the land still marked as federal interest. What does that mean now? Karen has no idea the man she finds is talking to the Navy. The morning air carried the scent of dew and burnt toast as Walt pushed open the door to Darlene's diner. The bell gave its usual chime, and the warmth inside wrapped around him like an old coat. Bert was already there, hunched over his mug, steam rising in lazy swirls. Walt slid into the booth. Appreciate you meeting me. Bert looked up. Heard you've been digging around about the lakefront. Walt placed the map between them. This here says the land was marked federal interest. Edith found it, dated 1974. Bert's weathered hands smoothed the edges. I recognize this stamp. Department of the Navy. These weren't public use lands, they were surplus, sure, but never officially released. Most folks forgot them. Walt tapped a faded square. You think it's still under federal hold? Bert didn't answer right away. He took a sip of coffee, eyes on the map. If it was never sold or transferred, maybe. Got some names for you, people who'd know more than I do. Used to work in Naval Land Use Registry. He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket and scribbled down a few names and numbers. Try Hayes. Lieutenant Commander. He's based out of Norfolk now. Walt nodded. Thank you, Bert. Outside, the sun had burned off the morning haze, and the street glistened from last night's rain. Back at home, Walt sat in his den, framed metals catching glints of sunlight from the window. He reached for the rotary phone and dialed. Lieutenant Commander Hayes speaking. Sir, my name's Walt Hammond. I'm a retired Navy man out in Kingsport, Tennessee. I've come across a land map from 1974 marked as federal interest, property now being claimed by a local HOA. There was a pause. Did you say Kingsport? Yes, sir. Lake Point Ridge, Melton Lake Shore. I'm going to need the coordinates or parcel ID. Can you send a scanned copy? I've got physical copies. Can mail them if needed. Hayes's tone shifted, a little sharper. We've had a few cases of dormant parcels causing headaches for civilian zoning. This might be another. I'll check something and get back to you. They exchanged contact details. Walt hung up and stared at the receiver. There was a weight in his chest, not dread, not quite hope. Just gravity. Later that afternoon, he opened his mailbox and frowned. A neon HOA flyer was taped right onto the lid, unauthorized surveying in violation of Bylaw 8.3, cease immediately. He peeled it off slowly, then chuckled. Karen's getting nervous. By sundown, he was back at Town Hall. The clerk recognized him and smiled as he filed a citizen request form to review HOA zoning boundaries. I want to know exactly what land they claim, he said simply. That night, a cool wind rattled the windows. Walt sat by the fireplace, thumbing through the old map again. His navy cap sat on the mantel, slightly dusty, the brim worn from years. The quiet filled with thoughts, memories of disciplined days, long-shuttered bases, and the silent dignity of veterans who never made noise unless necessary. The phone rang. Mr. Hammond? Hayes here. Walt straightened. Evening, Commander. I reviewed the parcel records. There's no evidence of formal release to civilian ownership. I've escalated the case. We're reopening the land review. Walt's fingers tightened on the receiver. You're saying it might still be federal? Yes, sir. You might be onto something. The next morning, Karen stood in her driveway, holding an envelope with an official Navy seal. She tore it open with a scowl, eyes scanning the bold letters. Land review in progress, restricted access pending. Karen's smile froze when two black SUVs with Navy tags pulled into Lake Point Ridge. The brunch had just begun. Folded napkins rested under finger sandwiches, and the scent of pumpkin spice potpourri floated lazily in the air. Karen, wearing a salmon-pink blazer and an overly practiced grin, was mid-sentence about community pride when the SUVs turned the corner. Their dark windows reflected the autumn sun like polished obsidian. Conversations tapered off. Walt sat alone in a folding chair near the edge of the event area, thermos in hand. He didn't say a word, just watched as the vehicles came to a smooth halt in front of the community center. The doors opened in practiced synchronization. Four uniformed officers stepped out, led by Lieutenant Commander Hayes, whose crisp salute to no one in particular was more ritual than greeting. Karen blinked, faltered. "May I help you?" Hayes walked forward with a neutral expression. "We're conducting a jurisdictional land survey on behalf of the Department of the Navy. Federal easement rights may still apply to this shoreline and adjacent lots." Karen's fingers clenched the stack of HOA newsletters she had been preparing to pass out. "This is a private event. Private property." "With respect, ma'am," Hayes replied calmly, producing a folded document, "this land is under review for federal interest. Will only be a few hours. No access to homes or personal property is necessary at this time." The brunch had gone utterly silent. A deviled egg dropped somewhere near the buffet table. HOA board members stood in uneasy clusters, murmuring. One of them stepped behind Karen like he wanted to blend into her shadow. Walt raised his thermos in a quiet toast to the air and took a sip. From his pocket, he pulled out his small leather notebook and wrote a single word, movement. Karen's face flushed. "This is harassment. This man," she pointed directly at Walt, "has been stalking, questioning, making phone calls to military officers. He is a disruptive force in this neighborhood." Hayes didn't blink. "Mr. Hammond has acted well within his rights as a citizen. Our team was dispatched following internal review, not at his request." Walt remained seated. "Just drinking my coffee," he said, smiling slightly. A younger Navy officer began setting up survey tripods and GPS equipment. Another unrolled a temporary sign from a black case and nailed it neatly into a post near the HOA's decorative brick planter. "Federal land, pending seizure review." The words, printed in bold Navy font, drew a collective breath from the crowd. Karen's mouth opened but no sound came. She pivoted quickly, whispering to one of the board members who nodded, then hurried toward the parking lot, cell phone already pressed to his ear. Neighbors who had been snacking on mini quiches now whispered behind their napkins. Some avoided eye contact with Karen entirely. Walt noticed Darlene standing just beyond the tables, arms folded. She gave him a small nod. Karen's voice, tightly controlled, rose again as she pulled out her phone. "I'll be speaking with my attorney. This is not over." Walt's phone vibrated gently in his shirt pocket. He stepped away from the brunch and answered with a quiet hello. A familiar voice replied from the county office. "Mr. Hammond? We've reviewed the permit history for Lake Point Ridge. Several of Ms. Whitmore's recent construction filings don't match approved zoning. We're freezing them pending investigation." Walt turned back toward the brunch, eyes resting on Karen as she paced, gesturing wildly to someone on the other end of her call. The Navy officers worked in quiet efficiency around her, taping boundaries, logging coordinates. He looked down at his thermos, then to the dusty Navy sign now standing like a sentinel beside the community planter. Things were beginning to shift. The permits were just the beginning. Walt now had a trail of paperwork leading straight into HOA misconduct. The municipal archive room was tucked behind a row of file cabinets and a door with a sticky hinge. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the air carried the scent of paper and lemon cleaner. Walt sat at a long wooden table, sleeves rolled up, reading through HOA expenditure logs from the past 5 years. Caleb, the city clerk's young assistant, worked beside him, tapping occasionally on a small laptop, fingers flying across the keys. "Okay," Caleb said, squinting. "Here's the file from 2021, Karen's first full fiscal year as president." Walt nodded. "Let's look at line items marked Community Improvements." They scrolled past holiday decorations, a new fountain, pressure washing for sidewalks, then deck restoration, $11,920. Walt leaned in. "Address?" Caleb clicked. "No listed location. Just filed under General Beautification." But the timestamp matches an email chain Karen had with a contractor about her backyard extension. Walt sat back slowly. "You think she used HOA funds for her private deck?" Caleb shrugged. "I'm not saying that, sir, but it sure doesn't look clean." Walt pulled out his notebook and, in careful block letters, wrote, "Audit trail, misuse, 11.9K deck, unlisted site." By mid-afternoon, he filed a formal complaint with the Kingsport City auditor. Caleb slipped him a copy of the submission for his records, then wished him luck with a smile. "It's folks like you keeping things honest." Outside, the air had turned sharp, winter flirting at the edges. Leaves crunched under Walt's boots as he made his way back to his truck. When he arrived home, a fresh HOA flyer had been taped to every mailbox on the block. "New policy, lawn ornaments require prior approval. Violations will be fined." Walt didn't even read the rest. He folded it into a neat square and tucked it into his pocket. Her tactics were sharpening. Later that evening, the smell of cinnamon and roasted turkey drifted through Darlene's diner. Soft country music played from a speaker above the counter, Kenny Rogers, something about rivers and memories. Walt settled into his usual booth with a slice of pumpkin pie already waiting. Darlene slid into the seat across from him, coffee in hand. "Heard the Navy's flag scared off Karen's brunch crowd," she said with a smirk. He chuckled. "You could say the tide's changing." The bell above the door jingled as a few regulars shuffled in, George with his cane, Mabel carrying a tote of knitting. They didn't speak loudly, but their eyes found Walt's, and small nods were exchanged. Darlene leaned closer. "Walt, these folks remember things. They've had fines, warning letters, threats. Karen's reign isn't new, it's just been quiet." Walt opened his notebook again. "I want names. Dates if they've got them." As Darlene returned to the counter, she handed him a folded piece of newsprint. "Found this in my attic box. Thought it might matter." He unfolded it gently. The ink had faded, but the headline still read clear. "Melton Lake land deeded to Navy, 1974. Beneath it, a black and white photograph showed two officers shaking hands with a mayor in a plaid suit. Walt studied it in silence, fingers resting on the margin. Back home, he placed the clipping on his desk beside the audit report. The pieces were falling into place. He traced the property lines with a pencil, then overlaid the HOA map he'd requested earlier that week. The realization hit like a cold splash. Karen's entire backyard, and most of her newly constructed home, sat well within the boundaries marked, Naval Use, Unreleased. He whispered into the still room, as though saying it too loud might bring the house down. "It's not just about the lake anymore. It's her whole house." Karen found a note on her front door, "Federal Site Review, 48 hours, restricted entry begins." The paper flapped slightly in the breeze, taped at the center with official Navy insignia printed along the margin. Karen stared at it for several seconds before reaching out with trembling fingers. Her SUV idled in the driveway, still warm from a tense trip back from town, where eyes had followed her more than usual. Across the street, Walt stood beside his old truck, sipping coffee from a battered thermos. He didn't wave. He didn't need to. Around Lake Point Ridge, Thanksgiving decorations were going up in fits and starts, plastic turkeys staked into damp lawns, garlands half-wrapped on porch railings. But there was hesitation this year. Neighbors moved slower, more thoughtfully. A flyer taped near the community bulletin board announced a potluck at Darlene's diner, the word HOA sponsored crossed out in red pen. Inside his workshop, Walt unfolded a thick envelope. Inside, a typed letter on Department of the Navy letterhead confirmed it. The federal land claim had been reactivated. The boundary markers from 1974 were legally valid. The HOA's developments, Karen's home included, fell within that zone. He ran a calloused finger across the words reclaiming federal jurisdiction, then folded it neatly and slipped it into his leather-bound notebook. Karen, meanwhile, paced her kitchen. Her phone buzzed constantly, voicemails from board members, a few defiant, most panicked. She sent out a mass text calling for an emergency HOA assembly. No one replied. The next morning, 2 Navy officers stepped from a black SUV in pressed uniforms. Lieutenant Commander Hayes greeted her with polite authority. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "this is a formal delivery of notice regarding your property's encroachment on federal territory." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came. The HOA charter in her hand suddenly felt weightless. A small crowd watched from porches and driveways. Hayes continued calmly, "Effective in 48 hours, further construction or access to the disputed parcel is prohibited pending resolution." Walt approached the scene slowly, holding something in both hands, a weathered metal stake with faded red paint, the original marker from decades ago. He walked past Karen, nodded politely, and planted it at the edge of her front lawn. From behind, a voice spoke low and steady. Bert stood near the sidewalk, hands in his coat pockets. "She built on hollow ground, son. Nothing solid holds her up." Karen's emergency meeting convened that evening in the community center. The folding chairs outnumbered the attendees. Of the 9 people who had once filled the board table, only 3 came. One woman, younger than the rest, stood up before the meeting started and quietly handed over her resignation. Walt didn't attend. He spent the evening fixing the bulb on his porch light, humming softly to a song on the radio. Darlene had promised to save him a slice of sweet potato pie from the potluck. Near the lake path, the community had gathered in quiet defiance of HOA restrictions. Dozens of American flags, some new, some stitched, some faded with years, were being hung from poles and porch rails. They caught the breeze as if the land itself was exhaling. Karen watched from her steps, wrapped in a too-thin cardigan. Her phone sat silent beside her, the screen black. The neighborhood had moved on, slowly, solemnly, but definitively. She sat alone on her porch as neighbors hung American flags along the lake path, on land she's no longer allowed to claim. On Thanksgiving morning, a black tarp covered the HOA sign, and Walt knew it was over. The mist rolled low over Melton Lake, curling around the faded gravel trail like a breath held too long. Walt adjusted his scarf and took a slow sip from his thermos as Bert joined him, his cane tapping rhythmically on the frosty path. The 2 men walked in silence for a while, their breath visible in the chilled dawn air. Where the old HOA sign once stood, a heavy tarp now sagged, weighed down by dew and the end of an era. The post beneath it leaned slightly, as if ashamed to hold up the lie any longer. "They finally took it down?" Bert asked, eyes narrowing. "Not yet," Walt said. "But they covered it. That's enough for now." The fence along the lake had changed overnight. Navy-installed posts lined the trail, spaced with precision and anchored with flags. Fresh signs declared it federal land, protected and public. The flimsy HOA ropes and warning placards had vanished. In their place, official boundary markers and a peace the community hadn't felt in years. Down the street, Karen's beige house loomed quieter than usual. No children's laughter spilled from its yard, no clipboard-wielding patrols circled the block. The city zoning office had revoked Lake Point Ridge's HOA status 2 days prior, citing financial irregularities, zoning overreach, and unauthorized construction over federal easements. Karen had received formal notice, 60 days to vacate all structures built over federal land. The foundation of her beloved back deck, once touted in a newsletter as a landscape marvel, had been poured right onto restricted soil. The deck would go. Possibly the guesthouse too. At Darlene's suggestion, the community picnic had replaced the old HOA brunch. Folding tables lined the park edge near the water, pies and thermoses laid out like offerings. Walt spotted children drawing chalk arrows along the sidewalk, spelling out, "Welcome back Lake Path," in looping pink and blue letters. He smiled. Darlene waved him over. They want you to say grace, she said, sliding a foil-wrapped pie into his hands. Walt looked around. People were laughing again, laughing with one another, not at warnings or whispers. A man strung white lights from a tree branch while another unboxed folding chairs. Someone passed out hand-knit scarves. He cleared his throat and tipped his old navy cap. Reckon I can do that. From the edge of his vision, he caught movement, Karen, in a heavy coat, loading boxes into a rented moving van. She moved slowly, eyes down. No one approached her. No one heckled. But no one helped either. Her world, once wrapped tightly around rules and fines, now sat half-packed in cardboard. Bert joined him by the navy marker. The lake glistened behind it, the sun finally breaking through. Walt tapped the sign lightly and said, "Think they'll build a dock?" Bert chuckled. "Only if we help." Walt never imagined that standing up for a parking spot would bring his town back to life. The first snowfall of December blanketed Kingsport in a thin, glistening hush. Along Melton Lake, the newly reclaimed public path sparkled beneath holiday string lights strung by neighborhood volunteers. Walt stood on his porch with a mug of black coffee, the steam mingling with the crisp air. A couple of neighbors waved as they passed, and he waved back with a simple nod. Across the street, where the old HOA bulletin board had once displayed fines and edicts, now hung hand-painted flyers about a holiday potluck and a toy drive for local kids. Karen's house, still for sale, sat quiet, the open house sign leaning crookedly, its letters smudged by frost. No one waved in her direction. Inside Darlene's diner, warmth spilled from the windows like sunlight in a snow globe. The usual crowd huddled over eggs and biscuits, but a new wooden plaque had appeared beside the register. It read, "Walt's Corner, coffee refills always free." Darlene only grinned when he'd protested. Walt hosted informal coffee mornings on his porch now. Neighbors came by to chat or just to sit. Some brought thermoses. Others brought stories. One woman handed him a knitted pair of navy blue mittens. "My husband served," she said softly. "Thank you for keeping this path open." A new community board had begun to form, no fees, no patrols. Just folks signing up to shovel walkways, deliver meals, and keep the lake clean. They met under the pavilion where Karen once held HOA brunches. Now it smelled like cider and cinnamon. One afternoon, Walt took his usual walk along the lake. The Navy signs still stood, but no longer felt like boundaries. A few ducks waddled along the bank, and someone had set out birdseed beneath the old bench. He sat down slowly, joints creaking, and exhaled into the wind. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, hesitated nearby with a football tucked under his arm. "You were in the war?" he asked shyly. Walt smiled. "Long time ago." "Did you ever win anything big?" Walt looked out at the water, the snow gently tapping the lake's edge. "This here, this piece, that's big enough." The boy sat down beside him without another word. From the diner patio came the soft hum of a carol. The breeze carried it across the lake, mingling with the quack of ducks and the crunch of boots on snow. Walt leaned back, his navy cap low over his brow, and closed his eyes.